Thank you. Welcome back. We begin the first of two panels in the afternoon session with a discussion about the role of recent scholarship in contextualizing, presenting, and theorizing Black artists and Black subjects in historical and contemporary art. The moderator of this panel, Dr. Eliza Kelly, is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English at Yale University. She earned her PhD in English from Columbia University and her BA from Wesleyan University. Dr. Kelly works on African American literature with an emphasis on how Black geographies and radical spatial practice in the United States. Her current research traces how Black spatial knowledge and practice appear in literature and art, particularly through experimentations with form, genre, and media. Her first book project looks at practices of inscription and mark-making as modes of spatial production, representation, and reinvention. The project contends that Black geographies both demand and usher forth specific and unconventional methods of reading and reading practices. As such, Dr. Kelly's work is also concerned with methodology, how we read and how we engage with archives, and how we do literary study. Dr. Kelly's second book project explores Toni Morrison. No? No? Not that part?
You don't have to read the whole thing.
Oh, okay. But it was just one more line.
All right, okay.
Yes, this is all about you. This is your moment, Elisa. Okay. Okay, one last sentence. Dr. Kelly's second book project explores Toni Morrison's theories of place and geography, which she has written about in Antipode, a radical journal of geography. And her other writing can be found in the New Inquiry, Cabinet Magazine, and elsewhere. Please welcome Dr. Eliza Kelly. And then our first panelist is Dr. Cheryl Finley, the inaugural director of the Atlanta University Center Collection for the Study of Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective, as well as distinguished visiting professor in the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College, where she leads an innovative undergraduate program at the world's largest historically Black college and university consortium in preparing the next generation of African American museum and visual arts professionals. A curator and contemporary art critic, Dr. Finley is also an award-winning author noted for her 2018 book, Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon, and her co-authored publications, including My Soul Has Grown Deep, Black Art from the American South, published by Yale University Press in 2018. Additionally, Dr. Finley's writing has appeared in numerous academic and popular publications. Dr. Finley's current research examines the global art economy, focusing on the relationship among artists, museums, biennials, and migration in the book project Black Art Futures and the interdisciplinary project Mapping Art History at HBCUs. Her scholarly endeavors have been supported generously by numerous foundations, including the Ford Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, the Alphonse Fletcher Senior Fellowship, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. On leave from Cornell University, where she is an associate professor of art history, Dr. Finley is also a visiting professor at the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Finally, Dr. Finley received her PhD from Yale University in African American Studies and the History of Art. And our next panelist, Nana Adusei Poku, is assistant professor in the history of art and African American studies at Yale University. Dr. Adusei Poku received her PhD from Humboldt University in Berlin. And before arriving at Yale this year, Dr. Adusei Poku was an assistant professor in African diasporic art history in the Department of History of Art at UC Berkeley in California. Previously, she was an associate professor at the Luma Foundation Scholar at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in New York, a visiting professor in art history of the African diaspora at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Sciences and Art in New York, and a visiting scholar at the University of Ghana, the London School of Economics, and Columbia University. Dr. Adusei Poku's research centers on cultural shifts through the intersections of art, politics, and popular culture, artistic productions from the Black diasporas, and curatorial practices as a means to shape historical discourses. She is the author of the 2021 book, Taking Stakes in the Unknown, Tracing Post-Black Art, and editor of the 2022 publication, Reshaping the Field, Arts of the African Diasporas on Display. Dr. Adusei Poku's recent exhibition, Black Melancholia, at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard in 2022, is the foundation for her next monograph of the same title. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished moderator and panelists to the stage.
Thank you so much, Keely. Okay, can you hear me? Sounds a little tinny, but that's okay. Thank you, Keely, and thank you so much also for just bringing us together and giving us this space to have this conversation, which I hope will be kind of wide-ranging, but also call back to the earlier panel. And then we're, of course, really looking forward to having a conversation with you all at the end. So I'd love to just start by hearing your impressions of the show. As art historians, sort of what is striking to you? What's exciting about this show? What kinds of things might it invite or open up for scholarship?
Okay, I'll go. Well, we can just tag team it. Thank you so much, Eliza, Keely, all of you. And it's a real honor to be sitting on this stage. I just wanted to begin by saying one of the things that I love is the interdisciplinarity of the exhibition and the way in which you and Mickalene worked together as co-curators, and how that brought together some really interesting strengths, but also works that were works from the archives that we learned something more about over the time in which you began the initial conversation. And when I talk about interdisciplinarity, I just want to cite this institution where I studied for my PhD, and I'm really happy to be seated across from Dr. Hazel Carby, and just delighted to talk about African American studies as an interdisciplinary, foundational interdisciplinary discipline in the way that it trained me in the field and also intersected with art history. And I think it's really important to have these kinds of conversations. And as this exhibition is at a teaching institution whereby we know that students that come from Yale, but also from around New Haven and Hamden and surrounding towns, have the opportunity to engage with it, that it gives them a narrative that's multi-layered, that is one that is, I want to say, almost kaleidoscopic in a way. It refers back to history and to the archive, to specific works of art. It engages with unearthing Yale's relationship to the history of slavery and the slave trade. But it also talks about the portrait miniature and this beautiful sense of being held and the ability to hold small objects in one's hands, and the ability to kind of think about how these works not only are from the 19th century or from the 18th century for that matter, but rather how they are in many ways echoing to us in the 21st century and possibly beyond. And I think the last thing I'll say, and maybe we can come back to this, is that there's this really beautiful, as a result of these multiple layers, there's a really beautiful, I want to say, reverb on the one hand, but also intergenerational narrative that I think increasingly these kinds of intergenerational narratives are so important. They're important for us who are here in the present, in the living. They're important for those of the next generation, but they also uplift, our teachers, our forebearers, and they also uplift the history that affects the way that we live today.
Mm-hmm. That's beautifully put. I cannot walk into exhibitions as an art historian. I walk into exhibitions as a curator. So I want to do crit, basically, coming from an institution that, has that practice of like walking into an exhibition and then tearing it apart. That's what I do. But it wasn't really that easy with this exhibition, and if I would have to teach this exhibition, I would certainly put it into the category of one that is in the affective mode, because the first thing that greets you is the darkness, right? Is that notion of interiority that is then evoked by the staging of the objects. So you're immediately physically, emotionally pushed into a space, and you have no possibility to, you forget where you are because it's so immersive. So that's the first thing. I am, as you know, we had a tour with you, so I'm currently teaching a class on the exhibition Freestyle and its concept post-Black. And so Mickalene Thomas was part of the second iteration of the so-called F shows. She was in Frequency. So when I learned from you, when I just started that this show would come here, I was like, yay! We can actually immerse in her work from the collection, but then also see what she's up to now. And we have another artist in the room, Adia Millett, who was part of Freestyle, and we watched the beautiful Charlie Rose skit with you, where you're talking about your work. So that sort of temporal dimension of like witnessing an artist who, really was like emerged out of that generation in that early 2000 moment is an incredible opportunity. And then it is an incredible opportunity to see the students in conversation with you. We're talking about curatorial strategies in the space. They pushed you at moments like, why is nobody allowed to sit on these chairs? And political questions come up, right? Like the question of like the hauntedness of the space that is haunted by the marginalized labor of Black women. But then also who is in the space, who is policing the space, etc. The students bring all of that up, and it's an utter joy and pleasure. It's an incredible resource to have here. So that's, my first impression was really that there is, to me, something is emerging at the moment. I cannot really put my finger on it yet, but is emerging in relationship to Black exhibition making. This show is in a tradition of, artist-curated shows. It's a bit more complicated because you two were in dialogue, of course, but we can draw that line from like a Gustave Courbet all the way to over Duchamp to, a Samela Lewis. Like it's, this is a genre in itself when artists are taking over a space. But then this is different. And I commanded you already that, I'm talking to Keely, sorry, that I think this is an absolutely astonishing example of what curation can do when you are in deep dialogue with an artist. Because I don't think that Mickalene Thomas would have worked with that material. You really pushed her out of her comfort zone, and something really remarkable and beautiful has emerged out of that, which is going to shape her practice in a different way, So, yeah.
Can I just add something that
Of course.
made me think about the idea of artist-curated exhibitions, and I'm thinking to myself, well, this is no mining the museum, right? But there was an invitation to consider the archive and to consider a specific work from the archive. And I think one of the things that's been really striking for me in thinking about running through the Rolodex of artist curated exhibitions, or the Fred Wilsoning of certain collections or archives, whether they're historical institutions or museums, that what I love about what happens here is it's not just beginning that kernel with the Prentice miniature, but also looking throughout archives here on campus, but also nationally, to engage in a conversation that's much larger. And again, thinking about the experiences and the beauty of and the struggle of Black women throughout that thread is something that makes it even more powerful. And you said, yes, the mood that sets it off, I think, is something that really makes it feel very, very different from what we typically experience in a museum setting.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Beinecke and the role that the Beinecke played, even with sort of providing this Wheatley material that's in the show. And then, of course, it almost was undermining the museum a little bit when Keely mentioned that they had considered bringing the furniture from the gallery into the space, which I thought was fascinating and a fascinating proposition. I love that you both mentioned intergenerational encounter and pedagogy, right? And the importance of pedagogy as something that this show offers, not just to scholarship, right, but to our teaching, to our students, and to a kind of intergenerational transmission, right, of practice, of theory, right? So I wanted to ask about history, about Black history, which the earlier panel addressed. So Black history is a critical aspect of this show. Not only do many of its objects and artworks reflect upon diasporic Black histories, but its inspiration and impetus, right, is fundamentally archival, as Cheryl just mentioned. The 19th century portrait of Rose Prentice, along with these other sort of similar small-scale portraits of Black subjects from before the Civil War. I was thinking a lot about your excellent work, Cheryl, on mnemonic aesthetics, right, and the slave ship icon. And then, of course, Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation, right, or what creative methodologies and practices might offer us in the face of historical erasure, absence, unrecoverability that can sometimes characterize archives of Black life. And Keely, in your catalog essay for this show, you write that critical fabulation was the key curatorial method, right, that she and Mickalene used. A, quote, restorative approach to telling the intertwining histories and individual stories of Black people in early America, end quote. So this show brings Black histories into a kind of historical assemblage, right? So that juxtaposition that we were talking about earlier, where Phyllis Wheatley's 18th century frontispiece engraving might be thought alongside Betty Saar's sort of enchanted objects. So I'm wondering about historical adjacency or juxtaposition, and also about contemporary works that take up historical forms and or subject matter. So can you both speak a little bit to how the historical is conveyed, but also experimented with in this show, right? And how we might think about the show within the context of what's sometimes called, for better or worse, right, the archival turn. Right? So, yeah.
I mean, I love the archival turn still. I have nothing against Hall Foster or what he describes in that really important article. I mean, we did two things, or when I visited the exhibition with the students, there were two different levels through which we looked at this exhibition. It's on the one hand following the trajectory of an artist that was framed in a very particular way. And then on the other hand, we utilized the historical material in order to have a contemporary conversation, right? I mean, Mickalene Thomas's work was so very helpful for my thinking about Blackness and modernity, really, because the work that I was obsessed with was Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, trois femmes noires, but the photograph, not the painting, was much easier accessible as the photograph than the painting, which is giant and hard to reproduce, etc. And it's an incredible tool to teach the absence of Black women in that work and in that time period, which has art historically been, of course, now, fed by fabulous scholars. What's her name?
Denise Morel.
Thank you. Denise Morel, or now the latest with Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby's Creole. So, you know, that's just how history comes in, and the absence of exactly the women that we're looking at in this exhibition. So that was the entry point for my students to go through this exhibition. But usually, I mean, how does it, I mean, I'm going to almost open it up outside of the exhibition, because you had a couple of slides from Titus Kaphar, etc. Like all these like amazing Black presently working artists who are deeply involved in, or Whitfield Lovell or Lava Thomas comes to mind when I look at Whitfield's work. It's like this, like going into the archive and resurrecting those stories, and then utilizing that in the classroom in order to, you know, deeper engage the students into that history. But I also don't want to lose sight of medium specificity, you know, of modes of presentation, discursive framing, you know. I'm blabbering away, so please, Cheryl.
You're not blabbering away.
Take the
Modes of presentation. Here we are with Genevieve's work.
Very true. I mean, there is. I mean, this is extremely performative, right? Like the space upstairs is extremely performative. Hence why this like affective mode is so important. You are thrown into history, but also, and this is again something where you have to just like let it sink in, with 44 very, very delicate loads in the space. I mean, that's like, it's not like transporting just, I don't know, necessarily, I mean, not just, but a work on paper, you know, from 2012. This is a completely different caliber of what's up there in the gallery, which has to be climate controlled and so forth. It's incredible. And with that, I think that's where the exhibition does something that we find in contemporary Black studies writing, right? Like the authors like Saidiya Hartman or Christina Sharp, who are pulling us into the conflatedness of history. I mean, this is something that I'm trying to touch upon with my project on Black melancholia, which is this sort of that feeling, that mourning, that sadness that is not just in the past, it is in the present, and there is also a futurity to it, which makes it so heavy, which is why the darkness of the space is so fitting for that experience.
Yeah. Sorry, let me stop. I'm going to hand it back to you.
I know, this is full of distractions and treats.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the question that you've asked. It's one of the things that makes the exhibition so powerful and so strong, that it kind of engages with this reflexivity that has become, I would say, a practice of many late 20th century and 21st century artists. And one of the ways that we get so much richness and texture is by having, on the one hand, I love that kind of, it's like a refrain, and Keely, you might have to help me with that 19th century interior portrait that we see on, I think, 3 different facades.
That is a late 19th century photograph of the interior of the Derry, New Hampshire home owned by Alanson Tucker, and Rose Prentice was employed by Alanson Tucker and helped to raise his children in that very space.
Thank you.
In the photograph.
Thank you. And so that there's a way that, like if we're talking, I know there was an earlier conversation in the first panel about time and the nature of the temporal, you know, whether it relates to history or the archive or, you know, today, IRL, or if it's, you know, about this futurity that I think we're all so very hopeful for the next generation. But what I love about that, that refrain of that photograph is that it gives us a sense of how, we've gone through each of the 4 sections of the exhibition, and then we see it again. So it makes us think again about where we are and what we've learned and why we're there. Another thing that I think that is really powerful and kind of relates to this notion of critical fabulation or a mnemonic aesthetic is the way that Mickalene engages as curator, as artist, as designer. I mean, we haven't really talked a whole lot about design, but I think that that's
We're about to.
Okay, all right. Well, that's the huge part, of that immersion experience that we get in the exhibition. Whether it's about her choice of skin tone, her skin tone specifically for the color of the walls, and we're so used to the, white cube. Okay, I think I'm anticipating your question. I'm sorry. But also this notion of design that that's also about an intentional, engagement with artists of the past that may be unknown, because we know that there are some of the portrait miniatures, the profiles, silhouette images where we don't know the sitter. We also may not know who the artist is. But the work of critical fabulation, the work of Mickalene Thomas is actually perhaps in a way surpassing that question of who were these people, but rather inserting them into a contemporary narrative and even inserting them into that historical narrative that is one of the underlying temporal pieces of the exhibition. I also really love, just from the pedagogical sense too, the curatorial pedagogical, but also the pedagogical for anyone who's in the room today who's teaching, in the New Haven area, or maybe you're on Zoom and you're going to come with your classes to the show. I think it engages with just about any discipline that we can think about. We've talked about art conservation and the question of, really what does it mean to conserve, to preserve, and why, and this is maybe going back to this notion of the archive and what's there, what's missing, what's not there, what should be there, and where the ghosts are. But I think that there's another way too, in terms of pedagogy, that we can teach, conservation, we can teach history, we can also look at these beautiful narratives by formerly enslaved people, freed people that are set, alongside the daguerreotypes in these low lumens, and then go to, whether it's the Beinecke or whether it's an online resource, to read about the life of Henry Bibb, and to read these narratives again. And I think the last thing I'll add before we move on to the next question is this is amazing. It's really nice that you don't necessarily have to, stand before a work of art as we're trained to do, and look, or read then look then read, and make sure that you ascertain what was actually there, but that we have this as a guide, and that there's additional writing in here that we can also absorb and learn from this multi-layered and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary experience.
Yeah, and talking about this, however, is like this is also not necessarily readable in the space now that crit comes out, because you can actually walk around with this in the exhibition space, but if it's, depending on your site, you won't be able to read it, so you're kind of forced to take it with you and then engage with it, which can be a tool. But I also wanted to add to what you just said to, kind of finish the notion, or not finish, but the notion on the historical is the conversation between the miniature or the scale in the space and the artists working today. That to me is like one of the curatorially just so beautifully chosen, so smart to say, hey, there's actually Black artists working in that scale today, which then opens up a completely new dialogue historically. Not necessarily in the sense of fabulation, but in the sense of what is the mode. I think Deb talked about the notion of intimacy in the first panel, and that to evoke that kind of intimacy in the space is extremely rare.
Yeah, I'm actually going to ask about that right now. I'm going to ask about design and I'm going to ask about scale, so you'll both have an opportunity to talk more about that. So we typically think of fine art being presented in the white cube, as you mentioned, Cheryl, the sort of white cube of the gallery or the museum, and I'm really glad you took us here, because this is exactly where I was going to go. I know we're right here right now. Obviously, this exhibition departs from that, right, from the white cube, giving another valence to the title, right, to the unlikely space of the title. For me, the exhibition space calls to mind other Black women artists who are sort of playing with domestic interiors, patterns, wallpaper. Micheline's work, of course, but also Ebony Patterson, who we see right here. And also Genevieve Gaignard, who, this is Sadie Barnett here, and then Genevieve Gaignard, right? So we see this kind of, this practice of, and there's a way that it's the artist curator kind of at work, right? Because the display of work requires the transformation of institutional space, right? Into these more sort of interior, intimate, domestic, right, vernacular, often feminized, right, spaces. And the domestic in this show, of course, is troubled by the simultaneous signaling of an intimate, lovingly adorned sort of Black household, an expression of what Elizabeth Alexander calls the Black interior, and also the domestic of domestic labor, right, of slavery, of servitude. So we have this kind of tension at work in the exhibition space itself. So what does it mean for the work to be exhibited this way? I'd just love to hear you guys talk a little bit about these fictive sort of domestic spaces. Can you help us contextualize this, thinking about the effects also on us as viewers? And then I'd also love to hear you both talk about scale, right? So the emphasis on Black private life often evokes, right, this intimate scale. And there's miniatures all throughout. And we have these beautiful examples from Curtis. Where are they? Here they are. So there's miniatures, right? There's sort of the dollhouse scale, the diorama, right? There's all of these small scale objects. And then these larger scale domestic spaces, right? This sort of human-sized chairs, right? And so there's this play between scale that you mentioned, Nana. So I'd love to hear you guys just talk a little bit about scale and about the space itself.
I think one of the things that I was thinking about when you finished your last comment, and also related to the question, though, is what I love what Micheline does with it, like with her, not just with the design, with color, and with the choice of, thinking about domesticity and intimacy in space, but also when we think about cased images from the 19th century, ambrotypes, daguerreotypes, tintypes, et cetera, handheld objects, they're super duper small. They fit inside of the hand. They're meant to be small. They have typically a closure. Sometimes that closure perhaps initially was to, on the one hand, protect them because daguerreotypes, because many of these earlier formats would need certain types of protection because they were so fragile. But also what Micheline does, in the exhibition is that she takes the daguerreotype or perhaps the format and style of that and completely blows it up. And she also, not only makes it larger in size, but her images, the one, I think it was Courbet number 3 that was shown in the last panel, is one that riffs on some of her earlier works, of course, on Courbet, but also then she's thinking about, of course, who are the people that would not have been pictured in that work from a much earlier period, from the 19th century. She also talks about intimacy. She talks about intimacy between women, and especially between Black women. And I like the way that, especially throughout the flow of the exhibition, I want to say it's in the middle, but then there are 4 parts, so I don't know if there's necessarily a middle, but in terms of the layout, that you also have an opportunity to see. There's a plan view of the exhibition in this guide. It has a place of primacy and a place of contemplation which, again, I feel like I'm talking more about the experience. I don't know if that's really what you're asking, Elisa, but there is this, difference between going to the very low lumen areas where those beautiful cases that were built for the rare books and for the cased images require you to get really, really close and to kind of focus hard and hope that you can see all the details, and then to kind of step back from her larger scale works. I think that's something that is was an experience for me, at least in the show.
I mean, quite practically thinking about the design, like there is moments when you come in and the notion of domesticity is heightened by the lowered ceiling, right? Like you come in and it's like you have a large, very high space. So lowering that part, and that happens on multiple occasions in the exhibition, again, accepts us more into human scale, which is really beautiful and creates like a more private moment. I am still, and then also one thing that when I walk through that, it doesn't trouble me, but it still confuses me that there is so much space where the courbets, etc., the bridge in between, where those older photographs are hanging, and I enjoyed that space, and I enjoyed the emptiness of it. And the reason why it troubled me is because I have been trained to have a different experience in the space. So there's also a rethinking and a little bit uncomfortableness with that. And what I really want to know if it's really her skin color that was chosen, because it immediately evokes for me to psychoanalyze the space. I'm sorry, It's like, am I really, and are we talking about like her interior as an artist? And with that, I think the reading also shifts for me again, because it's a very different approach to the previous spaces where, I remember in at the Brooklyn Museum exhibition where she had basically her source books, the interior decorating books from the 70s on display. And I was like, oh, this is where this pattern is coming from, etc. And you could, walk through the space. And of course, she talks a lot about that this is basically her childhood. So revisiting her childhood. Now we're revisiting with the skin color and with those images of these black enslaved women, a history. We're going deeper in. It's almost like we're going not into the. Are we going into the unconscious now, and not and with that unconscious, are we entering the unconscious of the United States? Of like really digging deep here, and that's where since this was mentioned, which was an information that I didn't have prior. I only knew about the blue and the brown. Also, I didn't recognize the blue on the walls, but there is a blue, and that, has, of course, also a connotation of sadness, feeling blue, etc. So I'm still thinking about what that little detail, which I think is really important, means, because usually we encounter this artist with bright 70s colors, right? I mean, that's what you think of when you think of Mickalene Thomas's work, and women. Go ahead.
I also just wanted to loop back to Mary's work too, in thinking about scale, I guess, but also, reclaiming histories and also representing histories, and the three works that she has in the style of the daguerreotype, with the reflective images, where she's in the process here of rewriting this history, horrific history of abuse of young black women that we now know of, from Thomas Eakins in the 19th century in Philly. And so when I think about those images, Mary's images, then the more formal portraits that we see in the exhibition that are also from the 19th century of, photographic media, and then the work of Michelini's more contemporary, larger images that also refer to that particular style. There's a way in which you kind of have a cross current with regards to the representation of Black womanhood in the photographic medium over time, and different ways in which narratives are being represented but also reclaimed throughout that medium, which has always, from the very beginning, some might say it's a truth-telling medium. Others might also talk about, of course, the violence that we know that it particularly inflicted upon Black people just from the inception of the medium in the mid-19th century. So that was just another thought around scale. And then, again, thinking about, the photographic and the design too, I mentioned that repeating photograph of the interior, but then it's also, against yet another layer, a mural as well. And you get the sense from I think it's even in this image on the left-hand side, there's also some, curling, handwritten, notation that gives me a sense of, oh my gosh, I'm in the archive, I'm immersed in the archive itself.
Yeah, I love that you bring up the sort of medium of photography, but also the mural, right? There's all of these different mediums at work, and that brings me to my next question, which is about intermediality. So Elizabeth Alexander's book, The Black Interior, is a really big part of the curation and the framing of the show. That's where the title of the show comes from, and it's actually pointing to a Gwendolyn Brooks poem. And then, of course, we have Phillis Wheatley, right, and Phillis Wheatley's poems on various subjects. Keeley writes in the essay that poetry is the project's driving force, right? So we have poetry, we have books, we have literature, but there's also the integration of other mediums. As we've talked about, we've got interior design, right? Photography, sculpture, we have lighting design at work here, furniture design, but also the works themselves represent this kind of broad, not just a variation of media, but actually intermediality within them, right, within the works. And while intermediality has always been a significant dimension of Black aesthetic practice, I'm thinking about it also sort of in scholarship, right, and in recent writing. So Tina Camp's Listening to Images, Brent Edwards' Epistrophes, right, also about intermediality, but also the use of visual media, photography in particular, in Wayward Lives, in Ordinary Notes. You mentioned Sharp and Hartman as well, or poets like Robin Cost Lewis, Natasha Trethewey, right, who are writing with photographs. So could you both just talk a little bit about the interplay of media? You've both sort of started in your own ways to talk about this, but if you could expand a little more about, the interplay of media in the show, and then maybe more generally about intermediality.
Maybe I'll leave the more generally to you, because I wanted to say that that I know about Mickalene Thomas's practice that she often uses as a starting point photography. And as we know, she ventured into film as well. And with that said, and with the staging, it's very cinematographic, right? And even some of the works, like the zooming into the daguerreotypes is almost like you're zooming into a scene. Adia Millet's piece is like the one that we just see a little box here, but when you look inside, it's like you're really, it's almost as if you're in a theater. There's this theatrical element. So, and what I learned from talking to artists, it's so important to pay attention to what they were trained in and what they determine as their basis. Like a sculptor has a completely different way of constructing a work, or they usually construct the work, as they would build something else, even when they make a film. And here, I think the baseline to me is still photography.
So, okay, I'm going to answer the question, but I wanted to go back to the point that you're making too, because one of the things, so I was here for the opening, and it was a total mob scene in the best sense of the word, as in like there were tons and tons of people here, and there was a lot of love in the room. So it's not that I didn't get a sense of the scale. I did. However, I did two things. One, I didn't really get a sense of, I want to say, the largeness or the bigness of the space of what I almost want to call, and you can kind of see this in this install shot, of the avenues. And you know, I think you were talking, Nana, about how when you have this moment to contemplate Michelin's own photographs, there's a lot of space there. Like it's, you know, it's a big, wide space. And this also reminds me of, like, if we were actually on like a real studio set, you know, it would be as big as this, you know? So whenever we see something, you know, in a little box on your televisions or whatever it is we're watching, or even on a big screen, we know that the spaces in which, you know, narrative cinema or even documentary film is shot are much larger. And so I wonder, to your earlier point about, you know, the base being photography, but we also know that she has done film. You know, is that something that we're seeing translated into some of the you know, the design and layout choices of this exhibition? Because there's a lot of space. When we were in there this morning, there were a small group of us touring with Keeley, and it felt like there was a lot of space, like it was very, very big, and again, intentionally so. Even the oversized nature of, you know, these chairs and the way in which they're juxtaposed with fireplaces and other things that we might think about from the 19th century. But I think the other thing I would add about intermediary, you know, considerations is also the film by Kiganye, which I absolutely adore, and have to say I missed it on the first pass because I entered in an opposite direction. But didn't really feel like I spent enough time in it this morning, so hopefully we'll have a chance to go back. But that film is stunning, and I think it's one that really helps to bring together some of these perhaps more separated or disparate parts of the entire exhibition that, you know, hint at, you know, the intimacy, that hint at, you know, what a 19th century space might be, a parlor might be, where you might be being entertained by a series of small cased images. And I just feel like that film, and also the, you know, the idea behind it, the keeper of the light, and the way that it talks about, you know, ancestral knowledge and heritage, but also signals to, you know, to the future, to you know, to how this, the knowledge of keeping light is something that has to be passed on. I think it also, for me, I just started to think about other artists who are working that are in conversation with Michelin Thomas, and I saw that you had the Whitfield Lovell shot there from a work that's here at the gallery, but there's also a really wonderful traveling exhibition of his work called Passages that just left the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. I can't remember where the next venue is going to be, but to consider other African American artists who are thinking about these interior spaces, but also these uncovered, or rather little discussed histories and places. Kijo Lee in the earlier panel talked about the Great Dismal Swamp, and how there are now all these, you know, different things that are being found, material objects in that space. And that's one of the topics that Whitfield Lovell has addressed in his own work, or even the work of Ayanna Jackson, who now has an exhibition in DC on the National Mall, the National Museum of African Art, the way in which she's also thinking about, in work that often and primarily pictures herself, but, you know, a time frame from the 19th century as well. So I'll stop there.
Don't stop. So I'm really glad that you took us here, because I wanted to ask about portraiture as a genre, Black portraiture specifically, which is an idea that has sort of gained considerable ground in the last decade, thanks in large part to Deb Willis. Where is she? She's in here. You know, and her stewardship of the Black portraitures conference, and also shows like the Wallet Gallery's Posing Modernity in 2018. There's also an upcoming show at the American Folk Museum that's called, I think, Unnamed Figures, which will be a lot of portraiture from the 17th to the 19th century in I think it's New England, or it's just early America in general. So this is a thing, right? This idea of a specifically Black portraiture. Rick Powell, for one, in his really important book, Cutting a Figure, argues that Black portraiture constitutes its own genre entirely, right? That it cannot be thought to be the same as portraiture in, the Western art sort of canon. So I'm curious about portraiture. I'm also wondering about the ways that portraiture has kind of consolidated certain ideas about sovereign subjectivity and the human, right? That might be at odds with the assertions of some people in Black studies, of the sort of collective communitarian emphasis of Black culture and politics. So thinking about Sylvia Wynter, Fred Moten, Zakiya Jackson, many, many, many other theorists and thinkers. I'm also thinking of artists like Simone Lee and Titus Kaphar. I have this image here, who both complicate figuration in part by dispensing with eyes or with faces, right? So here you see this is something Simone Lee does a lot with the eyes. And then we have this face that is made of tar, basically, or not face, right? This can be read as kind of an effacement, but it can also be read as protection, right? It can be read as refusal, a refusal of the gaze, a refusal of identification or individuation, refusal of the sort of brutal mechanics of portraiture's history and place in Western art. So I'd love to hear you both speak a little bit about portraiture and how Black subjects and artists potentially subvert or unsettle the genre of portraiture and the practice of figuration. And perhaps how Black portraiture might speak to the need for representation or alternative representations, and at the same time, the limits of representation.
There were multiple questions in that question.
Right? I tried to get all my questions in there.
I mean, it's a beautiful question, and I'm grateful that you're bringing it up because I'm still busy thinking about this show and thinking about the time. I mean, there's Portrait of an Unlikely Space, right? The exhibition is a portrait, which now affirms me in my sort of thinking about the brown of the walls and the notion of interiority in relationship to the artist who put it together with Keeley. And that leads me actually into something that I've been thinking about a lot, which I think is specific to Black portraiture, is the notion of multiplicity despite and abstraction despite the figurative presence. So you can look at this Titus Kaphar piece and think about it as like, refusal or protection, but you can also with this open up multiplicity that is behind that black, grayish mud or tar. I mean, I think also, I always love to think with Glenn Ligon in relationship to portraiture, because when you look at his early stencil pieces and the way how the lines turn from like single lines, I always feel most colored when I'm thrown against the sharp white wall, and then it starts to blur, and then all of a sudden you have a black mass. And it's almost as if there's a polyphony in the repetition, which then brings so many voices out, which then creates a portrait of like Black people saying this all, because it's such a common experience. And with that said, there is something in Black portraiture that never only speaks about the individual, and so I don't necessarily think it is in contradiction to the claim for humanness, but I mean, you know, with Zakiya Iman Jackson, we may have to think it just like in different terms. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. And I also want to add to the list of exhibitions the really amazing show that the Zeitz Museum had put on in South Africa, When We See Us, which was fairly recently on display, and it's, I think, traveling as well. It's traveling, and it's looking actually at portraiture from the African continent in dialogue with the African diaspora. And I think that's like curatorially an incredibly important move, because we have been, like, we are connected and cannot think without each other.
Yeah.
The title too of this painting even, right?
Yeah.
Calls that multiplicity up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I also love the notion that, yes, it's never about the singular. It's always about the collective or the group or you know, a larger history or community. And also, I think the idea of how abstraction can also be thought of, or is a mode of portraiture for some artists. And I'm thinking of like some of David Hammond's pioneering body prints, for example.
Yes.
But also, I just wanted to say, some of you already know I'm here, you know, and thankfully for our conversation, but also I'm traveling with students from my program. And today we had the lovely mid-morning opportunity to be at the British Art Center Print Study Room with Joy Gregory, who's a visiting artist, visiting here from South London and conducting research. And, you know, and while we were in the BAC, which is closed right now, we were exiting, and I stopped and I said, so, you know, this is one of the things that you should, I wish we could see, but we were on the second floor, and in this building, when I was here in school, there were these huge portraits. I don't even know how, they were just like a story tall. They weren't that tall, but huge portraits of the landed gentry, you know, from the 17th century, from the 18th century. And these are the kinds of portraits too, though, that people like, obviously, Titus Kaphar, you know, were in conversation with, who was also in school here. Yeah. I happened to be here too when Mickalene Thomas was in school at the Yale School of Art, also when Kehinde Wiley was in school at the Yale School of Art. And so when I think about, again, this idea of portraiture and the way that, you know, many of our artists today are engaged in conversation, but also interventions with works of art, you know, that have for so long, you know, been the mainline narrative that are in our art history seminars and classrooms and textbooks. And the last thing you've landed on this, Simone Lee, in my teaching in the last year, I guess it was 2021, 2022, at the Atlanta University Center at Spelman, we had a course that was dedicated to the work of Simone Lee. And this was in advance of her showing at the Venice Biennale. She was the first Black woman to represent the U.S., the American or U.S. pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And there's actually one student sitting right here in the front, Tanisha Carter Johnson, who was in that class and whose writing from that class still lives on the website at the U.S. State Department. And they've been engaged with this touring exhibition, which just opened in Washington. And she wrote specifically about, you know, the erasure of the eyes and what that means. So I think getting back to this notion of, you know, portraiture as abstraction, but also portraiture as protection, portraiture as thinking about, you know, temporal lives and lineage is something that this exhibition engages with really beautifully.
Thank you so much. Of course, I have another question, but it's time to move into Q&A. So please, I think someone's going to be coming around with a mic. So gather your thoughts.
Well, whilst you all gather your thoughts, I give you some time now that you know you have to talk. I wanted to add to that something about, these portraits, because what I think is so beautiful also about the show, thinking about it as an artwork, is that we have all of this vocabulary from Black studies, right? Which most Black artists are also deeply immersed in, and then reemerges. But because with these artworks we're entering something else, which challenges, I think, not only theory often, but also is theory in itself, and allows something else to emerge out of it. Because, you can look at this work and be like, yeah, sure, like oppositional gaze, bell hooks, check, check. But no. And then it's like, no, that's too flat. Yeah. No, something else is happening here. And then that needs like new vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so beautiful also upstairs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for this talk. My name is Tanisha Carter Johnson, a proud member of the AUC Art Collective. Such a fruitful conversation. There's so many points and reflections that I have, but a question I have, especially entering the space earlier, was that the space itself kind of acts as this like period room, which I've seen a lot at the Met, and how they point to a lot of these like European kind of styles of how we think of space, how we think of history, and the merging and the marrying of the two. How does this space in particular, especially using upholstery and furniture, act in that same way? And what additional kind of deliverables or didactics does the programming of the show overall allow for students to take away from the show, the history that's being told as well? So that was like 2 questions, sorry. Hopefully those make sense as well. If you would like for me to reiterate, I can.
I'll start, or do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the things, that's a really great point, because it does call up the period room at the Met, or maybe you go to a house museum, a historical house museum of someone from a different period in time, likely in New England or in Europe.
House.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
or upstate New York.
Yeah, or William Church.
Yes.
No, was it William? Frederick, thank you. Frederick Church's villa.
But I feel like there's a certain feeling or sensibility maybe in some of the settings where you have like the chair or the piece that it like the mantelpiece from a fireplace, or even, I love the, Keely was talking about how the ceiling is dropped in some of those more intimate spaces to give that sense of interiority. But one of the things, and maybe this is like, I spent not too much time, but I knew this place from another time. I think one of the things that I really like actually is that this is not a house museum. It's not the period room at the Met. It's none of those things. This is the Yale University Art Gallery. It's an art gallery. And so because of that, often we might maybe be more accustomed to being in, the question you had about the white cube space. Yeah. We're more accustomed to being in a space that has all white walls, or that when you go into the exhibition of, modern painting, or the modern painting room, or the photography wing, or whatever, it's going to be photograph after photograph after photograph. It's going to be 2D. It might have a historical narrative or trajectory. But here, there's this mashup of, different media. There's a mashup temporally of what you see. You might see, a wing chair that might make you think about the 1970s, looking at the work of Micheline Thomas and how she has these references from that time frame. But then when you look at the fabric is referring to different quilting traditions. And so I kind of like the fact that we're in this space, and the exhibition is one that has such a depth and richness that you are really forced to, I think, curatorially speaking, and perhaps even institutionally speaking, about how it is that we present art. Because let's face it, okay, Lanice Williams, who was one of my classmates when I was here in graduate school, she's now at UNC Chapel Hill. She did an exhibition, I'm going to totally forget the name of it, but it was in Bridgeport. They have a really, really rich collection of African art there. And she was asked to do an exhibition while she was in grad school. And so what she did was, instead of doing this show of African art presented in a modernist way with everything on a pedestal, she had 3 different spaces. One space was, and this gets back to your last question, which we're not going to have time for, but anyway, one space was, what it's like to go into storage in a museum. You're in the storage, conservation issues, climate, et cetera, and everything's just on a rack. It's on, shelves, and it might be labeled, there might be a tag. There's no pedestal, but it's kind of out of context. Maybe there are things from certain regions on the continent. No one, of course, knows who the maker was, et cetera. So that was one space, again, and this is in an exhibition space. The next space was the modernist exhibition. Everything was on a pedestal. And then the last space was, this is how we live with our art. This is how you live in your home. You're going to have a sofa, maybe. You might have, a coffee table. And then she also had monitors where there were clips from Frasier playing. Sorry, I'm totally dating myself. But anyway, but just to kind of give a sense of what, and to answer your question, I think that, it makes me think about the different ways that as curators, we tell the stories. And there can be there's the white cube model, which is a model that I think we're still very much beholden to, but then there's also a model here where you interact with artist and curator and you have this intergenerational conversation and you pull in other things that add depth to what the possibilities are. Sorry for the long answer.
It was a beautiful answer, actually, and also made me think about, with these 3 different references that you brought up, the importance of exhibition histories and knowing exhibition histories when your curatorial practice evolves, right? This exhibition, as I mentioned, I would teach it as this is definitely affect driven, if not also psychoanalytical now, right? I developed this here on stage. But but I think this doesn't happen that often, and something that I also don't want to let fall underneath the table is that there is this is because of the sensory sort of experience, this is very indulgent. It's an indulgent space, even if it's a space that is marked by violence, right? But this is not a cheap exhibition at all. So thinking about emerging curators, you get a budget of maybe you have $5,000. So, and you want to pay the artist, etc. Okay, you may fundraise another $5,000, so you have $10,000. This is not a $10,000 exhibition, clearly, right? So I think this leads us into a conversation around budget and appreciation for Black art inside of institutions, and that something like this is utterly beautiful and important, and I think pays also respect to the work and to the historical material, and it is necessary, and it cannot be budgeted into a museum's roster in okay, there are 2 months, we need a Black artist on the roster, so let's have this person for 2 months, and then let's make a commission, let's give them $5,000. That doesn't work. And I think that's also very present in this exhibition, that there was effort, and with effort also comes monetary effort, and that's something that you always have to fight for as a curator. And you can also not develop a show like this within half a year, which you may be forced to in a museum, right? Something fell off, the artist is not available, so then you're pulled in and you have to quickly put up a show. It's time and I mean, all of the elements that we deserve as Black people basically are also symbolized in this exhibition. It's the time, it's attention, it's also commitment, exactly, commitment, care, exactly, on all levels. It's not like self-care, you take a bath. No, sometimes you need a check. You know? You always need a check. That's where self-care starts. So.
And I think we're done, right? Or do we have time for another question? I think I got a sign. Did I get a sign?
There's
Oh,
there's
uh-oh.
another hand.
That's it.
One more question, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Good afternoon. My name is Harlem Henderson. I'm a junior art history major with a minor in studio art.
His mic is off. Could you turn the mic back on, please?
I already turned it on. Should I say all that again?
No, we caught that, I think.
Well, my name is Harlem. My question is, how is curating a space when you get to speak with an artist and when you start to understand their creative process by speaking to them? Because when an artist makes something, their interpretation on their creation might be a bit different than the curator. So those two minds coming together can produce something that's vastly different than the individual. So if you could explain that, that'd be great.
Do you want to take that,
Keely,
Keely?
take that?
No.
No.
Special guest.
I can talk to it in
Yeah,
terms
a
of
little
like, I mean, there's different
Other
modes, right? Like how you engage with an artist. Like there's artists, as in this exhibition, who are not with us anymore. So you're trying to display the work. Some artists of the 20th century have left instructions, so you try to follow that. Those who didn't leave instructions, then they are at your mercy, sadly. Then you have artists that you invite into an exhibition, and you want to make sure that you are sharing your vision for what it is, why they should be in this exhibition, what you appreciate about their work, etc. But you may want to have a relationship prior, or if you pulled it from a collection, you want to make sure that you have a conversation with them and not just put something onto their work and then, you know, display it, and potentially even share whatever you want to write about the work. We have an artist panel later, so I think the artists can talk more about that. And then there's the mode where you commission, which is what happened here, more or less. Like, not really, as I said, it's hard to categorize.
Yeah, and I would just.
But when it comes to commission, you have, I mean, I try to have a relationship with the artists that I commission over a long period of time, and then you start talking about what you want to explore. If it's for a group show, there's a set theme. If it's for a solo show, then it's really the artist who guides you in the process, and then you may have to say, this is possible in the space, this is not possible in the space, etc. Yeah.
I was just going to add, it's really about, I think, the relationship. You know, your relationship as curator, let's say, with the artist. And Harlem, you're also an artist, so perhaps your relationship as artist with the curators, and making sure that you keep, you know, that channel of communication open, that you understand what each other needs and wants, and that you have a vision that might not necessarily be the exact same vision, but it's unified in such a way that it translates for the purposes of the exhibition, and the learnings that you would like those who have the opportunity to experience your show to take away.
And I think also really important, since you said that you just started to study, is that you always have the possibility to say no. Right, as an artist. And that happens as well. Like, I have a wonderful friend, and we're very good friends, and she has an incredible photographic practice, and every time I come to her with like a proposal, she's like, no, Damn, when am I going to nail it? It's predominantly about like identity, and I don't want to be in a black group show. Okay, fair enough. I'm saying this so lightheartedly, but then there's also, of course, the socio-economic reality of being an emerging artist, and you may not be able to say no out of financial reasons or reasons of exposure to the art world. It's extremely complicated, and I'm pretty sure that the artists in the room can speak much better to that, but I have definitely witnessed that.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna end there.
Thank you.